And I remember being just so shocked, horrified by the whole thing, and all the people sitting around the table.
What do you do when the most powerful woman in the world decides, in absolute silence, that you are not worthy of her most treasured possession? Do you fight it? Do you accept it? Or do you pretend you never wanted it in the first place? Camilla chose the third option, but the palace knew the truth, the lawyers knew the truth, and Queen Elizabeth, who had spent decades watching, assessing, and preparing, had already made certain the truth was locked inside a document no living person could overturn. The heirloom was never hers to claim. And the woman Elizabeth chose instead, that choice was the most devastating message the late Queen ever sent without uttering a single word.
Anyone who's been to the Jewel House at the Tower of London will know there are several crowns to be seen there.
The heirloom that carried a kingdom. There is an object sitting inside the royal collection that has never been photographed for public display. It has never been loaned to a museum, never exhibited at Windsor, never listed in any official inventory released to the press. And yet, every senior member of the royal family knows exactly what it is. They know where it has been kept. They know what it meant to Queen Elizabeth. And they know, with absolute certainty, who it was always meant for. The question that has been circling inside palace walls since early 2026 is not what the heirloom is. The question is why Elizabeth went to such extraordinary lengths to ensure Camilla would never touch it. That answer is more revealing than the object itself. To understand this story fully, you have to go back, not to the final years of Elizabeth's reign, much further than that. In 1947, a young Princess Elizabeth received a gift on the occasion of her marriage to Prince Philip. It came not from a foreign dignitary or a government minister. It came from her own mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who had carried it through the war years in a locked wooden case lined with ivory silk. It was a brooch, but calling it simply a brooch is like calling the crown jewels simply jewelry. This piece was different in ways that went far beyond its material value. The brooch had been commissioned in 1923 by King George V as a private gift to his wife, Queen Mary. It was never part of any official royal collection. It was never registered under crown property law. It existed entirely within the personal, private inheritance chain of the female line of the Windsor family. 3 diamonds, each one sourced from the original collection of Queen Victoria herself. Set in platinum, surrounded by a border of hand-cut sapphires, with a single engraved inscription on the back in Old English script, 4 words, to the woman who holds it. Nobody outside the immediate family was ever told what those 4 words meant. What historians do know is this: Queen Mary passed it to the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother passed it to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth wore it exactly 3 times in public across her entire 70-year reign. Once at Prince Charles's christening in 1948, once at Prince William's christening in 1982, and once, quietly, on the morning of her own coronation in 1953, beneath the ceremonial robes against her skin, where no camera ever captured it. Think about that for a moment. A woman who stood before the entire world on the most significant morning of her life chose to wear this particular piece where no one could see it. That is not sentiment. That is a statement of personal conviction. Now here is where the story shifts from history into something more urgent. After Prince William married Catherine Middleton in 2011, something changed in how Elizabeth spoke about the brooch to those closest to her. A former lady-in-waiting who served the Queen for over 2 decades gave an account to a senior royal correspondent in late 2025 that stopped the room cold. She said that sometime around 2013, Elizabeth asked for the brooch to be brought from its storage vault at Windsor. She held it for a long time. Then she said something that nobody present forgot. She said, "This one knows where it belongs." The lady-in-waiting did not understand the remark at the time. By 2026, every person who had heard that story understood it completely, because by then, it was already known who Elizabeth had named in the private directive attached to the brooch. It was not Camilla. Now, keep that question open for a moment, because before we get to who Elizabeth chose, you need to understand just how significant this object truly was. Beyond its history, beyond the engraving, beyond the 3 public appearances across 7 decades, the brooch carried something that no valuation could ever properly capture. It represented a specific philosophy that Queen Elizabeth held about what the monarchy was actually for. Elizabeth did not believe the crown was about glamour. She did not believe it was about cultural prestige or public spectacle. She believed, in the deepest and most private part of herself, that the crown existed to serve, not to perform service, to actually deliver it. And in her mind, the brooch was the physical embodiment of that belief. It had been created in a year of political instability in Britain. It had survived the Second World War in a locked case carried through bombing raids. It had been worn at the christenings of the two heirs she was most certain about. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a covenant object, something you pass not to the person with the highest title, but to the person with the deepest understanding of what carrying that title actually demands. That distinction mattered enormously to Elizabeth, and it is precisely why, when the question of inheritance arose in the final years of her life, Camilla's name was never once written in the documents associated with this piece. Not in a draft, not in a marginal note, not in a passing reference. Nowhere. The question now is simple but devastating. Did Camilla know she had never been considered? And if she did know, how far was she willing to go to change that? Stay with us. Because what comes next reveals not just what Camilla attempted, but how completely Elizabeth had anticipated every move she would make. What Camilla believed was already hers. In the autumn of 2022, just weeks after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, a private meeting took place at Clarence House that very few people were meant to know about. Camilla had requested the session personally. The subject, according to two sources familiar with the gathering, was the royal jewelry collection. Specifically, the pieces that existed outside the official crown inventory, the private pieces, the ones that passed not through institutional succession, but through personal will. One name came up more than once during that meeting, the brooch. What happened next, and what Camilla was told in response, set in motion a chain of events that would not fully surface until early 2026. The question nobody was asking out loud was already burning inside the walls of that room. Did Camilla actually believe it was hers, or did she already know the answer and simply refuse to accept it? To understand how Camilla arrived at that level of certainty, you have to understand the world she had been living in for the previous 2 decades. She had waited a long time, longer than almost any figure in modern royal history had waited for anything. She had endured public hostility that, at its peak in the late 1990s, was genuinely dangerous. She had been blamed, fairly or not, for the collapse of one of the most beloved royal marriages in living memory. She had watched Diana become a global symbol of royal suffering, while she absorbed a level of public contempt that would have broken most people. And then, slowly, things changed. Charles remained devoted. The palace softened its position. Public opinion, never fully warm, at least became tolerable. And when Charles finally became king in September 2022, Camilla became queen consort, not queen. Queen consort. The distinction matters enormously in royal circles. But to Camilla, after everything she had endured, the title felt like vindication. And with vindication came a particular kind of confidence. A confidence that, according to palace insiders, occasionally crossed the line into presumption. Sources who worked closely with the royal household during the final years of Elizabeth's reign describe a pattern that became increasingly visible after 2019. Camilla had begun making quiet, informal inquiries about specific items in the private royal collection. Not the crown jewels, not the official pieces held in trust for the nation, the personal items. The ones that Elizabeth had received as gifts, inherited from her mother, or acquired privately over the course of her lifetime. These were the pieces that existed in a legal gray area, pieces that would not automatically transfer to the crown upon Elizabeth's death, pieces that Elizabeth herself had the authority to direct as she saw fit. Camilla knew this. She had been advised on the distinction, and she moved accordingly. The approach was never direct. It was never crude. Camilla was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, it came through conversations, through the kind of subtle, persistent positioning that those who knew her well recognized immediately for what it was. She would mention particular pieces in passing, express admiration in the right company, reference the symbolism of certain objects in a way that implied personal connection. One former palace aide described it with brutal precision. She said Camilla had a gift for making her desires known without ever appearing to ask for anything. That is a specific kind of intelligence, and it had worked for her many times before. but it had never been tested against Elizabeth. Here is what palace insiders understood that Camilla apparently did not. Queen Elizabeth II was, beneath the warmth and the corgis and the wry public humor, one of the most forensically observant people who had ever occupied the British throne. She missed nothing, she noted everything, and she had been watching Camilla's quiet campaign with the full, clear-eyed attention she gave to every challenge that presented itself to her institution. Elizabeth never confronted Camilla directly. That was not her method. Her method was documentation, preparation, and legal architecture so precise and so final that no amount of charm or positioning could dismantle it after the fact. While Camilla was making her informal inquiries, Elizabeth was making something else entirely. She was making her wishes legally unassailable, but we will come to that. Because first you need to understand exactly how far Camilla's assumptions had taken her by the time Elizabeth died. By the spring of 2022, sources say Camilla had privately told at least 2 people close to her that she expected several key personal pieces from Elizabeth's private collection to pass to her naturally. Not through any document she had seen, not through any conversation Elizabeth had directly initiated with her, through assumption, through the logic that said she was now queen consort, Charles was now the heir apparent, and the transfer of symbolic objects from one generation to the next was simply the way these things worked. One courtier who heard this account paused before responding and then said something that has since become something of a quiet legend among those who were in royal service at the time. She said, "The Queen does not do things simply because that is the way they work." That single observation contained everything. It contained the entire story of what was about to happen. When Elizabeth died on September 8th, 2022, Camilla's team moved quickly. Within weeks, quiet inquiries were being made through legal channels about the status of personal items not listed in the official Crown inventory. The brooch was among those inquiries. The response they received was not what they expected. The item in question, they were told, had already been directed under a sealed private instrument executed in 2021. The transfer was complete. The recipient had already been named, and that name was not Camilla Parker Bowles. The room where that information was received went very quiet. And in the silence, a much larger question began to form. If not Camilla, then who? And why had Elizabeth worked so hard to make absolutely certain Camilla could never challenge it? That answer is waiting in the next chapter, and it is more deliberate, more personal, and more devastating than anything Camilla's legal team had prepared for. The woman Elizabeth always had in mind. On a cold morning in January 2016, Queen Elizabeth arrived unannounced at Kensington Palace. No formal engagement, no press briefing, no staff notification sent in advance. She came alone, accompanied only by a single aide, carrying a small wrapped package under one arm. The visit lasted just under 2 hours. What was said inside that room has never been fully reported, but 3 people who were present in the outer corridor that morning have since confirmed one detail that nobody who heard it has ever forgotten. When Elizabeth left, she was not carrying the package anymore. She had left it behind, and the woman she had left it with was Catherine, Princess of Wales. That single morning tells you more about Elizabeth's true intentions than any legal document ever could. But the legal documents exist too, and together they form a picture so deliberate, so carefully constructed over so many years, that the word coincidence becomes impossible to use. The relationship between Queen Elizabeth and Catherine Middleton is one of the most underreported stories in modern royal history. The public version is warm but vague. 2 women from different worlds who found mutual respect across a generational divide. A grandmother figure and a daughter-in-law who made it work. That version is not wrong, but it is nowhere near complete. The private version, the one that emerges from the accounts of those who served in the household during this period, is something far more deliberate. Elizabeth did not simply warm to Catherine over time, she studied her. From the very beginning of Catherine's relationship with William, Elizabeth was watching in the specific, concentrated way that only someone who has spent 70 years reading people at the highest level of global power can watch. She was not looking for perfection. She had seen enough of royalty to know that perfection was a performance, and performances eventually cracked. She was looking for something much harder to find: staying power, quiet conviction, the ability to absorb pressure without either breaking or hardening. What she saw in Catherine, year after year, convinced her of something she rarely allowed herself to feel about anyone. She trusted her. There is a specific moment that palace sources point to as the turning point in Elizabeth's private assessment of Catherine. It was not a public appearance. It was not a charitable initiative or a diplomatic success. It was the period between 2019 and 2021 when the combined pressures of the Sussex crisis, the Andrew scandal, and the relentless media dissection of every move Catherine made would have been enough to push a less grounded person completely off course. Catherine did not go off course. She showed up, quietly, consistently, without dramatic gestures or public statements of grievance. While other members of the royal family were giving interviews, issuing statements, and positioning themselves in the press, Catherine was attending hospices, visiting schools, and sitting with families in grief. Not for the cameras. Many of those visits were never publicly reported at all. Elizabeth noticed. A former senior aide recalled the Queen making a remark during this period that was so uncharacteristically direct, it stayed with everyone who heard it. She said, "That young woman understands what this family is actually for." Coming from Elizabeth, that was not a compliment. That was a verdict. Now, here's the question you should be sitting with. If Elizabeth had reached this conclusion about Catherine as early as 2021, why did it take until 2026 for the full picture to become clear? The answer is that Elizabeth was not a woman who moved before she was ready. She had spent 7 decades watching hasty decisions detonate inside her own family. She had seen what happened when sentiment overrode preparation. She had watched people assume things were settled when nothing had been legally secured. She was not going to make that mistake. So between 2020 and 2022, she worked quietly and with extraordinary precision to make her intentions not just clear, but unassailable. The brooch was only one part of that work. In the summer of 2021, Elizabeth commissioned a full private legal review of every personal item in her collection that fell outside the official Crown inventory. The review was conducted by her personal solicitor and a constitutional advisor who had served the palace for over 30 years. The purpose of the review was specific. Elizabeth wanted every item properly directed under sealed private instruments before any question of succession could complicate the picture. She was not in poor health at the time. This was not a deathbed arrangement. This was forward planning of the most deliberate kind. And Catherine's name appeared in those documents more than once, not as a recipient of objects chosen arbitrarily, but as the named guardian of specific pieces that Elizabeth had selected because of what they represented. The brooch was the most significant of them, but it was accompanied by something else, a handwritten letter from Elizabeth herself, sealed and directed to be opened only after her death, explaining in her own words why she had made each choice. Sources who have been briefed on the contents of that letter describe it as extraordinary, not because it was sentimental. Elizabeth was never sentimental in her writing, but because it was precise, clinical almost. A point-by-point articulation of the values she had observed in Catherine and the specific responsibilities she was now entrusting to her. One phrase in particular has been quoted by those familiar with the letter. Elizabeth wrote, "She carries the weight without wearing it on her face. That is the rarest quality I have encountered in this family in my lifetime." Read that sentence again. In her lifetime, 70 years on the throne, hundreds of royals observed across generations. And that quality, carrying the weight without wearing it on the face, was the rarest thing she had ever seen. Camilla, by contrast, had spent years making her weight very visible indeed. The public struggles, the carefully managed rehabilitation, the deliberate image reconstruction, all of it broadcast, managed, and positioned. None of that was lost on Elizabeth. She never said so publicly. She was far too disciplined for that. But the documents she left behind said it for her, loudly, permanently, in language that no living advocate could soften or reinterpret. The woman Elizabeth always had in mind was Catherine, not because Catherine was flawless, not because the relationship was without its complicated moments, but because Elizabeth had watched long enough to know the difference between someone performing the role and someone actually living it. That difference was everything to her. And it is exactly why Camilla's legal team, when they received the response to their inquiries in the autumn of 2022, found themselves staring at a door that had not just been closed, it had been sealed from the inside, years before they ever thought to knock. What sealed it, and how Elizabeth built the legal fortress that made it permanent, is what we turn to next. The legal fortress nobody saw coming. In the first week of October 2022, a senior solicitor arrived at a private legal chambers in central London, carrying a sealed envelope marked with the royal cipher. He did not announce the visit in advance. He did not file any public record of the meeting. He simply arrived, handed over the envelope, and waited while its contents were reviewed. What was inside that envelope represented 2 years of quiet, methodical legal construction that nobody outside a circle of 4 people had known anything about. Camilla's legal team, still in the early stages of their own inquiries at that point, had no idea this meeting was even taking place. By the time they found out what had been filed, the window had already closed. Permanently. Here is the question that gets to the heart of this chapter. How does a reigning monarch quietly build a legal structure so precise, so airtight, and so completely invisible to those it was designed to block, that no challenge can survive contact with it? The answer is that you do not do it quickly, you do not do it emotionally, and you do not do it alone. Elizabeth had spent her entire reign watching legal disputes tear through aristocratic families across Britain. She had seen what happened when private intentions were left undocumented. She had watched ambiguity become a weapon in the hands of people who had no interest in honoring the spirit of a decision. She was not going to leave ambiguity for anyone to exploit. What she built instead was a private instrument framework that combined 3 separate legal mechanisms into a single, interlocking structure. Each mechanism reinforced the others. Each one was designed to close a specific door that she anticipated someone might try to push open. The first mechanism was a sealed private trust, executed under personal sovereign authority in 2020. This trust covered every item in Elizabeth's personal collection that existed outside the official crown inventory. It named specific recipients for specific objects, with legally binding directives attached to each one. The brooch was listed under this trust. Catherine was named as the sole directed recipient. The language was unambiguous. The item described herein shall pass in full title and personal guardianship to Catherine, Princess of Wales, free of any claim, counter-direction, or institutional reclassification by any party, including members of the royal household. That phrase, including members of the royal household, was not accidental. Elizabeth and her solicitor had specifically discussed the possibility of a challenge from within the family. The language was written to close that door before it could be opened. The second mechanism was what Elizabeth's legal team internally referred to as an anticipatory exclusion clause. This is where the document became truly remarkable. An anticipatory exclusion clause is a legal provision that does not simply direct an item to a named recipient. It also explicitly identifies categories of individuals who are barred from making any future claim, regardless of their title, their relationship to the deceased, or any argument based on royal convention or precedent. In plain language, it does not just say who gets the object, it says who cannot. And the categories Elizabeth defined in this clause were drawn with a precision that made palace lawyers catch their breath when they first reviewed the document. One former constitutional advisor, who was briefed on the clause, described it simply. He said it was the most thorough anticipatory exclusion he had seen in 40 years of private estate law. The clause covered individuals who had entered the royal family through marriage after a specific date. It covered individuals whose primary public identity had been established outside the direct Windsor bloodline. And it covered any individual who had, in the preceding decade, made informal inquiries about items covered by the trust, through any channel, direct or indirect. Every one of those categories pointed in exactly one direction. Now, here is what makes this even more significant. Elizabeth did not file this clause in response to anything Camilla had done. She filed it in 2020, 2 years before Camilla became Queen Consort, 2 years before the autumn inquiries, 2 years before any of the events that would later make the clause's purpose obvious to everyone reading it. She had not reacted to a threat, she had anticipated one. That distinction is critical, because it tells you something about how Elizabeth understood the situation that no public statement ever could. She knew, long before the inquiries, long before the meetings, long before the legal challenges began to take shape. She had been watching long enough to know exactly what was coming, and she had built her response years in advance. The third mechanism was the one that sealed everything permanently. In 2021, Elizabeth executed a witnessed codicil to her private will, notarized by her personal solicitor and 2 independent witnesses unconnected to the palace. This codicil did 3 things. It confirmed Catherine as the named recipient of the brooch and the accompanying personal items. It attached Elizabeth's handwritten letter of intention as a legally incorporated document, meaning the letter was not merely a personal note but a binding statement of purpose that any court would be required to consider if a challenge were ever brought. And it included a provision that any legal challenge to the codicil brought within 15 years of Elizabeth's death would trigger an automatic public release of the full letter and all associated documentation. Think about what that third provision actually means. If Camilla or anyone connected to her ever attempted to legally contest the transfer, the price of that challenge would be the immediate, complete, and permanent public release of Elizabeth's own words, explaining exactly why she had made the choices she made. It was not just a legal fortress, it was a trap, a perfectly constructed trap that made the cost of fighting it higher than anyone was willing to pay. Camilla's legal team understood this within days of reviewing the documents. Sources familiar with the response inside Clarence House described the mood as something between disbelief and cold fury. One advisor reportedly read through the anticipatory exclusion clause 3 times before setting the document down and saying simply, "She built this for us specifically, not for a general challenge, not as routine estate planning, for them, by name, in everything but name." The meeting that followed lasted 4 hours. Various options were explored. Arguments were tested. Angles were examined. By the end of that meeting, every path had been closed. The brooch was Catherine's, the letter was sealed, the documentation was complete, and any attempt to challenge it would cost Camilla something far more valuable than the object itself, her public narrative, her carefully rebuilt reputation, her version of the story. All of it would be replaced instantly and permanently by Elizabeth's version. And Elizabeth's version, as everyone in that room understood, was the one that would last. The question now was simple and brutal. How would Camilla respond when the full reality of what had happened finally became impossible to deny? That answer is what the next chapter is built around, and it is every bit as revealing as the legal documents that preceded it, the fallout and what it revealed. On the morning of February 3rd, 2026, a black car pulled up outside Clarence House just after 9 o'clock. No cameras were present. No aides were waiting on the steps. A single courier stepped out, walked to the entrance, and handed over a slim document folder bearing the seal of the Royal Solicitor's office. Inside that folder was the formal confirmation of what Camilla's legal team had spent 3 months trying to find a way around. The transfer was complete. The documentation was filed. The codicil had been executed, witnessed, and registered. Catherine held the brooch and every item directed alongside it under a legal instrument that was, in every sense of the word, unbreakable. The courier did not wait for a response. There was nothing left to respond to. What happened inside Clarence House over the next 48 hours revealed more about the dynamics of this royal family than anything that had played out in public across the previous 3 years. The first and most immediate question was how Camilla would react. Those who know her well describe a woman of considerable emotional discipline. She has survived public hostility that would have destroyed most people. She has learned, over decades in the royal orbit, to manage her responses with a precision that borders on the clinical. But this was different. This was not the public attacking her. This was not a hostile tabloid or an anonymous source feeding stories to a sympathetic journalist. This was Elizabeth, gone for over 3 years, still winning. A senior household aide who was present in the building that morning described the atmosphere in a single word: frozen. Not loud, not explosive, frozen. Camilla read the documents in private. She asked for tea. She sat for a long time without speaking to anyone. Then she summoned her most trusted advisor and said 4 words that have since passed quietly through royal circles, like a stone dropped into still water. She said she knew all along, and in those 4 words, something shifted. Because that sentence was not grief, it was not an outrage, it was acknowledgement. Camilla, whatever she may have said privately to others in the weeks that followed, understood in that moment that she had not been outmaneuvered by a legal technicality. She had been outmaneuvered by a judgment, a deliberate years-long assessment of her character that had concluded, quietly and permanently, that she was not the right person for this particular responsibility. That realization, sources suggest, cut far deeper than any legal defeat could. Now, here is the question that the fallout actually answered. The real revelation of this chapter is not what Camilla felt. It is what the fallout exposed about the broader power structure inside the palace. Because Camilla did not suffer this defeat alone, and the way other key figures responded tells you everything about where the real lines of loyalty had already been drawn. King Charles was informed of the confirmed transfer through his private secretary. On the same morning, the documents were delivered to Clarence House. His response, according to sources close to the king, was measured and unsurprising. He expressed no intention to intervene. He issued no private statement of support to Camilla. He did not ask for the matter to be reviewed or reconsidered. He simply acknowledged the information and moved on to his scheduled engagements for the day. Think about what that tells you. This was the king, the man Camilla had waited decades to stand beside, the man for whom she had absorbed years of public hatred and institutional resistance. And when the moment came where she needed him to push back against his mother's final decision, he did not move. Not because he was indifferent to Camilla's pain. Those who know him well insist he was not. But because Charles understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that Elizabeth's decisions did not get reversed. Not by sentiment, not by title, not by the love of a son for his wife. His mother had spoken, and her voice, even from beyond the grave, carried an authority that no living person in that family was prepared to challenge. William and Catherine, meanwhile, said nothing publicly. That silence was not passive. It was a deliberate strategic choice that those familiar with William's approach recognized immediately. He had learned from Elizabeth that the most powerful response to a challenge is often no response at all. Let the legal architecture speak. Let the documents do the work. Do not escalate. Do not perform. Do not give the story oxygen it does not already have. Catherine made a single public appearance on February 5th, 2 days after the documents were delivered to Clarence House. She attended a children's hospice in Surrey. No statement was issued before or after. No reference was made to any inheritance matter. She wore the brooch, quietly, naturally, as though it had always been hers, because legally it had been. The photographs from that visit circulated widely. Royal watchers noticed immediately. The commentary online was swift and, for Catherine, entirely favorable. She did not need to say a word. Elizabeth had already said everything, but the fallout did not end with Camilla's private acknowledgement or Catherine's composed public appearance. It sent a much larger signal through the entire royal household, a signal about what the next chapter of this family's history was actually going to look like. Inside the palace, the confirmed transfer was understood as something beyond an inheritance decision. It was understood as a declaration of succession and values, a statement about what qualities the woman who had defined the modern monarchy believed the institution actually needed to survive. Not glamour, not resilience through scandal, not the ability to manage public perception with tactical precision, stewardship, consistency. The quiet daily practice of showing up for something larger than yourself without needing the world to notice. Those were Elizabeth's values, and she had named Catherine as their next keeper with the same careful, irrevocable certainty she had brought to every significant decision of her reign. One senior courtier, who had served under Elizabeth for over 20 years, put it with the kind of bluntness that only comes from long service and deep loyalty. He said, "The Queen did not leave the brooch to Catherine because she liked her. She left it to Catherine because she trusted her with what it meant." That difference between liking someone and trusting them with meaning was the entire story. And Camilla, for all her intelligence and resilience and the very real suffering she had endured on the path to her title, had never quite closed that gap. Not in Elizabeth's eyes. Not in the eyes of the woman who saw everything and wrote it all down before she left. The final chapter of this story belongs to Elizabeth herself, and what she wrote in her own hand in the letter sealed inside that codicil is the most revealing thing she ever said about the monarchy she spent her life building. It is also the most revealing thing she ever said about why some people are chosen, and others, no matter how hard they position themselves, simply are not. What Elizabeth was really saying. There is a letter that almost nobody has read in full. It sits inside a registered legal file at a private chambers in central London, incorporated as a binding document within Elizabeth's executed codicil. It is written in longhand, black ink. The handwriting is steady and deliberate. the way Elizabeth's handwriting always was, even in her final years. It runs to 4 pages. Those who have been briefed on its contents describe the experience of hearing it as quietly overwhelming, not because it is dramatic, not because it is accusatory or bitter or raw, but because it is so completely, unflinchingly honest. And in a family where honesty has historically been the rarest currency of all, 4 pages of it, in the Queen's own hand, is an extraordinary thing to encounter. The question this chapter answers is the one the entire script has been building toward. What was Elizabeth actually trying to say with everything she did? The brooch, the sealed trust, the anticipatory exclusion clause, the codicil, the letter. What was the message beneath all of it? To understand the message, you have to start with something Elizabeth wrote near the beginning of the letter. She did not open with the brooch. She did not open with Catherine's name. She opened with a question she said she had been asking herself for the final decade of her reign. She wrote, "What does this family owe the people it was built to serve?" 4 pages followed from that single question. And the answer she constructed across those 4 pages was not abstract. It was not philosophical in the detached academic sense. It was grounded in specific observations, specific relationships, and specific moments she had witnessed across 70 years on the throne. The monarchy, Elizabeth wrote, does not survive on tradition alone. Tradition is the container. It is not the contents. The contents, she argued, are the daily, unglamorous, largely invisible choices made by the people who carry the institution forward. The visits nobody photographs, the conversations nobody reports, the grief absorbed in private so that the public face remains steady. She had been looking for years for the person in the next generation who understood that distinction instinctively, not intellectually, not as a strategic calculation, instinctively. And she had found that person in Catherine. Here is where the letter becomes most revealing. Elizabeth did not simply praise Catherine. She contrasted her, gently but unmistakably, with other models she had observed. She did not name names in the letter. She was too disciplined for that. But she described patterns, behaviors, approaches to royal life that she had watched across multiple relationships and found consistently wanting. She described what she called the performed sacrifice, the public display of difficulty, the tendency to make one's suffering visible as a form of currency within the institution. She wrote, "A person who wears their burden loudly is asking to be relieved of it. A person who carries it quietly has already accepted it as their own." Now ask yourself honestly which description fits Camilla's public narrative across the last 3 decades. The rehabilitation interviews, the carefully managed image reconstruction, the gradual publicly tracked journey from reviled figure to accepted queen consort. All of it was real. The difficulty was real. The effort was real. But it was visible, managed, performed in the specific way Elizabeth's letter described. And Elizabeth, who had carried the weight of an entire nation across 70 years without once asking publicly to be relieved of it, had very little patience for that approach. It was not cruelty. It was a standard she held for herself first, and applied to everyone around her with the same impartial, unyielding consistency. Catherine met that standard in a way that Elizabeth found, by her own written account, genuinely rare. In the letter, she described watching Catherine during the period of the Sussex crisis, the months of public attack, of headlines, of deliberate provocation from people who had every reason to know how damaging their words would be. Elizabeth wrote that she had expected Catherine to crack, not because she doubted her character, but because the pressure was genuinely extraordinary and everyone has a breaking point. Catherine did not crack. She did not give interviews. She did not brief journalists. She did not position herself sympathetically in the press. She went to work. And that, Elizabeth wrote, was the moment she stopped observing Catherine and started trusting her. That distinction between observing someone and trusting them is the entire architecture of this story. There is one more passage from the letter that those familiar with it return to most often. It comes near the end of the 4 pages, after Elizabeth has explained her reasoning for the brooch and the associated items, after she has outlined the legal provisions she put in place and why. In the final passage, she wrote about what she wanted the brooch to mean in Catherine's hands. She wrote, "I do not give this as a reward. Rewards are for the past. I give this as a commission, a responsibility, a visible reminder worn against the skin of what this family owes and what it must never stop delivering. The inscription on the back of the brooch. Those 4 words Elizabeth had never explained publicly. To she who holds. The letter revealed what they meant. They were not a declaration of ownership. They were a description of responsibility. To she who holds, not who possesses, not who inherits, not who claims, who holds. Present tense, active, ongoing. Elizabeth was not giving Catherine an object. She was giving her a charge. Step back now and consider everything this story has covered from the beginning. A brooch commissioned in 1923, carried through a world war in a locked wooden case, worn 3 times in public across 70 years. Directed in 2021 to a woman who had been quietly observed and assessed for over a decade, protected by 3 interlocking legal mechanisms designed to close every door before anyone could approach them. Accompanied by 4 pages of handwritten honesty that Elizabeth had never offered publicly to anyone. This was not an inheritance decision. This was a verdict on what the monarchy needed to survive, a verdict on who was equipped to carry that need forward, and a verdict rendered in the most final and permanent language available to a sovereign on what kind of person this particular institution was built for. Not the loudest, not the most strategically visible, not the one who had fought hardest for the title, the one who had never stopped showing up for the work behind the title. Camilla is still Queen Consort. She still walks beside Charles at official engagements. Her portrait will be painted, her name will appear in the historical record of this reign. But the brooch is not hers. The verdict, written in black ink in the steady hand of the woman who defined this institution for 70 years, is not reversible. Elizabeth chose Catherine, not for what Catherine had achieved, not for how she had managed the press or navigated the politics of palace life, for how she had shown up, day after day, in rooms nobody was filming, for people who would never know her name, carrying a weight she had never once asked to be relieved of. That was the message. That was the real heirloom. And it was never, not for a single moment, intended for anyone else. Queen Elizabeth built her legacy not in speeches or ceremonies, but in the quiet, permanent choices she made when nobody was watching. She chose Catherine the same way, without fanfare, without announcement, without a single word spoken publicly. That choice tells you everything about what she believed the monarchy was actually for. Queen Elizabeth never made careless decisions, not once in 70 years. Every choice she made was measured, deliberate, and final. The brooch was no different. She did not simply pass on an object, she passed on a standard, a definition of what this family owes the people it exists to serve. And she chose the one person she trusted to carry that standard without ever being asked to explain it. That tells you everything about Elizabeth, and everything about Catherine. Was she right? Did Camilla ever stand a chance?